The echo of a voice shattered the silence of the Icelandic glacier. Enough! King Charles's roar cut through the frozen air, startling the poachers who moments before had been laughing over their bloody spoils. Soldiers in white camouflage surrounded them, weapons raised, nets at the ready, the king himself standing at the front with fire in his eyes. For a heartbeat, the Arctic seemed to stop breathing. But how had the monarch of the United Kingdom come to be leading an armed unit across the frozen edge of the world? To understand, one must go back just hours earlier, when whispers of a crime against nature reached his ears. The icy winds of Iceland carried secrets, and Charles was not deaf to them. Rangers had warned him of ships lurking offshore, hunters trespassing into forbidden lands, firing into the stillness and dragging away wounded seals. As the details unfolded, Charles's jaw tightened. He had spent a lifetime preaching about climate, ecosystems, and conservation. But this moment demanded more than words. It demanded action. "We intervene tonight," he ordered, shocking even his closest aides. The British Special Forces accompanying him did not question. They prepared, their rifles slung, ropes coiled, nets ready, faces painted white like the snow they would merge into. They advanced silently over the shifting ice, every step a reminder that one wrong move could send them plunging into the frozen sea. At one point the ground beneath them cracked, sending a jagged thunder across the night. For a moment, soldiers froze, breath caught, as the ice trembled. Charles raised his hand firmly, his voice steady, "Forward. The earth itself is testing us." The unit pressed on. Soon the distant echo of laughter and a single gunshot broke the stillness. Charles signaled. "Now." What followed was chaos. The poachers turned in shock, one raising a rifle in desperate defiance, but a soldier's shot rang out, striking the weapon from his hands. Nets were hurled, men dragged down, wrists bound in seconds. Charles strode forward, his voice a storm, "You disgrace this land. You call yourselves men while torturing the innocent." His fury was raw, his tone thunderous. Some poachers stammered excuses, others struggled, but resistance was futile. Within moments, the criminals were subdued. And then the king's gaze fell upon the true victims, seals, bleeding, trembling, eyes wide with terror. He dropped to his knees beside one, pressing a gloved hand gently against its side. "We will not leave you here," he whispered. His soldiers carefully lifted the wounded onto sleds, covering them with blankets as though they were fragile treasures. To the prisoners he turned, his face carved in stone. "You will face judgment, not only the law of Iceland, but the conscience of the world." The wind carried his words like a curse upon them. But the journey back was perilous. The snow thickened, the winds howled, and the sleds carrying the wounded slowed their pace. Twice, a prisoner stumbled and had to be dragged forward. Once, the ice gave way beneath a soldier's foot, plunging him knee-deep into freezing water. Charles himself reached down, hauling the man to safety, declaring, "No one falls behind, not man, not beast." And still they pressed on until at last the silhouette of the Royal Navy vessel loomed against the horizon, a fortress in the frozen dark. Sailors rushed to meet them, unloading the sleds, transforming parts of the ship into medical bays. "Careful, careful," Charles commanded. "Keep them warm. Monitor their breathing. Let them know they are safe." His royal garment soon bore blood and salt, his hand steady as he helped hold down a struggling animal for stitches. Veterinarians flown in from Reykjavik worked tirelessly, stitching wounds, inserting fours, calming the terrified creatures. Hours passed, the cries of pain giving way to softer sounds. Some seals, once trembling, began to nuzzle the hands of those who healed them. Charles's voice broke into a whisper, "They trust us. This is why we fight. Not for vengeance. Not for glory. For this trust." Yet not all survived. One seal, gravely injured, convulsed on the table. Charles stood by, fists clenched, helpless as the team worked frantically. For a moment, it seemed death would claim it. "Do not give up," he urged. And against the odds, the creature stabilized, its breathing slowing, its body finally still in peace. Relief swept the room, but the moment seared into every heart. This was not merely an operation, it was a battle for life itself. Meanwhile, the prisoners were locked below deck, silent and sullen. They had seen the wrath of the king, felt the weight of justice pressing down like the Arctic sky. "You will not escape this," he told them coldly. "When you close your eyes, remember the eyes of those you harmed." Above deck, Charles stood before his men, exhausted but unyielding. Word of their actions was already racing across the world. Headlines in Reykjavik shouted, *King leads armed raid against poachers. Social media exploded. Some hailed him a hero, others questioned his boldness, but no one could deny the image, a monarch with blood on his gloves and fire in his eyes, defending the voiceless. The next dawn was pale and quiet. Charles rose before the crew, stepping into the medical bay to find the seals stronger, calmer. Some were even fed fresh fish, their eyes glistening with gratitude. The king's heart swelled as he stroked one survivor, its gaze meeting his as though to say, *I know you saved me. He ordered the healthiest to be released. Sailors carried them to the shore, opening gates as the seals slid back into the sea. They dove beneath the waves and resurfaced, splashing joyfully. Watching them swim free, Charles felt a surge of triumph unlike any crown or throne had ever given him. He then gathered his soldiers, sailors, and Icelandic officials, addressing them on the deck. His voice rang across the Arctic waters, "What we witnessed here is a crime against nature and against ourselves. When we destroy the innocent, we destroy our own humanity. Let the world know, those who exploit the earth will meet justice, wherever they hide." His words were recorded, broadcast globally, sparking debates and admiration alike. Back below, he confronted the prisoners one final time. "The law will judge you," he said, "but the world has already judged." Their silence was their only reply. Outside, the aurora blazed across the sky, as though the earth itself bore witness. When the ship docked at Reykjavik, crowds waited in the cold. They cheered, waved flags, and lifted drawings of seals sketched by children. Charles descended, not as a distant monarch but as a man who had fought, cared, and triumphed. He greeted the children, smiling through exhaustion, a lump in his throat. In that moment, he was not only a king, he was a guardian. And so he whispered to himself, as much a promise as a vow, "I will not stop." For Glacier would melt, forests would burn, seas would be poisoned. But so long as he lived, there would be resistance. The battle for Earth had only just begun. And to those listening now, ask yourself, if you stood upon that ice, if you saw the innocent suffer, would you act? Tell us. Because every voice matters, every choice matters. Subscribe, share, and stand with those who cannot speak. The seals, the forests, the earth itself, they are waiting for us to choose. Thus was born the legend of King Charles in Iceland. Not a tale of pomp, not a ceremony of crowns, but of defiance, compassion, and courage. History was written not in palaces, but in the frozen silence where justice spoke louder than guns. The ship docked in Reykjavik beneath a sky painted with pale northern light, and already the air was alive with voices. Crowds had gathered despite the biting cold, their cheers carrying across the harbor like a tide of human warmth against the icy backdrop. Some waved Union Jacks, others Icelandic flags, but most held nothing more than drawings clutched by small hands, children's sketches of seals, whales, and icy landscapes, symbols of innocence offered to the king who had defended it. Charles descended the ramp slowly, each step deliberate, his boots crunching against the frosted wood, but his eyes softened as he caught sight of the children in the front rows. A boy lifted a crayon drawing of a wounded seal wrapped in a blanket, and for the first time since the raid, Charles's face trembled with emotion. He approached the boy, knelt despite the cameras flashing around him, and placed a hand upon the child's shoulder. "You drew this?" he asked gently. The boy nodded shyly. "Then keep drawing. The world needs more guardians like you." The crowd erupted, not in the roar of politics or spectacle, but in something quieter, deeper, respect. Here stood not a distant monarch but a man who had risked the ice, shared the struggle, and carried the wounded himself. He was no longer merely King Charles, to those gathered, he was a protector. Inside, however, the king knew this was only one victory in an endless war. As he stood once more before the microphones and cameras, he chose his words not for politics but for the planet. "This is not the end," he declared, his voice steady and grave. "The glacier will continue to melt. The forests will burn. The oceans will suffer. But we are not powerless. We can act. We must act. And as long as I draw breath, I will stand against those who harm the innocent." His words were carried instantly across the globe, repeated on every channel, translated into countless tongues. Some praised him as a warrior king, others criticized his intervention, yet none could ignore the truth of what he had done. But perhaps the most powerful moment came after the speech, when he turned back to the sailors and soldiers who had stood by him in the snow. "You carried more than rifles out there," he told them. "You carried hope. Remember that when you return home." And then, almost as if speaking to the world itself, he added, "The fight is not mine alone. It belongs to every one of you watching, every one of you who chooses to care." As the northern lights flickered faintly in the evening sky, Charles boarded his plane bound for Britain. Yet his gaze lingered on the horizon, on the dark waters where seals had returned to the sea. He whispered to himself, so quietly it was nearly lost to the engines, "I will not stop." And now, as you hear this story, ask yourself, if a king can leave his palace to stand in the ice, what can you do where you are? Would you have shouted enough when the moment came? Would you fight for the voiceless when it was easier to stay silent? The answer matters, because this story is not only about Charles, or Iceland, or the seals. It is about us all, about the choices we make every day between destruction and protection. So join this fight. Share this story. Add your voice to the chorus that tells the world we will not stand idle while innocence suffers. Because history is written not only by kings, but by the countless ordinary people who refuse to look away. And one day, when future generations ask what we did when the earth was wounded, let them hear that we stood together, we fought together, and we chose life over silence. As the engines of the royal plane thundered against the icy runway, Charles leaned back into his seat, eyes fixed on the dark horizon beyond the window. The aurora still shimmered faintly, fading ribbons of green and gold across the sky, like a benediction from the earth itself. He thought of the seals now gliding through the cold waters, healed and free. He thought of the children's drawings pressed into his hands, fragile papers heavier than any crown. And he thought of the poachers chained below deck, faces marked not only by defeat but by the memory of a king who had shouted into the storm, a king who had stood where few expected him to stand. But even as the plane rose into the night, his mind did not rest. He saw images of other places, forests in flames, rivers choked with plastic, elephants slaughtered for ivory, coral reefs bleaching into ghosts. The battle for Iceland seals was won, but the war for the planet raged on across continents. "This will not be my last fight," he murmured, gripping the armrest with quiet determination. "Not while I breathe." Somewhere out there, new enemies of nature prepared their crimes, believing no one would stop them. They had not yet heard the roar that froze men in their tracks on the Icelandic ice. But they would. And so this story does not end here. It continues in every forest, every ocean, every voice that dares to say, "Enough." Because the true power of that word is not in the mouth of a king, but in the hearts of millions who choose to repeat it. Now, it is your choice. Will you stay silent, or will you raise your voice? Share this story, let it carry across borders like the northern lights across the sky. And remember, history listens. The earth listens. And one day, the children holding their drawings will ask what you did when the world needed you.